Thanks everybody for being here. I'm Chuck Finn with the Fordham Institute and the Hoover Institution, and both organizations are pleased to welcome you to the sixth in our series called Education 2020. Appreciate your braving the weather today, but it was worth your doing so because we've got this really stellar pair of speakers and the papers that they have written, a summary version of which you will get orally. My privilege to talk with Eliot Cohen first, then we'll have a very short break, and then Mike Petrilli and Yuval Levin will be up here. You can read Eliot's biography on the back of the program. As you will see, it doesn't even begin to list all the places where he has been and worked. For example, I don't believe it mentions the State Department, where he also worked for a couple of years in addition to the Defense Department and Harvard, and currently Executive Vice Dean at SAIS, which is undergoing a whole series of changes of its own. And I may be taking over the museum for all I know, yes? Maybe. Not maybe, all right. So wherever you used to go to the museum, you'll be able to visit Eliot in his office, in his future office. So congratulations on that. It is a lovely and I think interesting paper he's written, currently entitled History, Critical and Patriotic, about the intersection of history, of civics, and of patriotism, and some of the challenges that we face in that intersection. And I welcome him to the podium, and please join me in greeting him, and I will look forward to conversation afterwards.
Thank you, Checker, for that introduction. It's great to be back at Hoover. I think this is my first time with Fordham. I think what triggered the piece that that Checker asked me to write was a column that I wrote in The Atlantic, where I now write regularly on the theme of patriotic history and its place, and I've been thinking about that theme, and I'm going to actually explore a little bit more, including some areas beyond the short paper I wrote. Now it's a little bit anomalous because I'm a professor and now an executive vice dean at a school which doesn't even teach undergraduates. We only teach MA students and PhD students and so on. And I've never taught K to 12, which I know has been a kind of a major focus of yours. I have raised 4 pretty patriotic kids, if I may say so, including two service members. And so far, my 5 grandchildren, at least the ones who can talk, seem reasonably patriotic too. And what triggered the article in The Atlantic was actually when my mother passed away at the ripe old age of 90 a couple of years ago, going through the house, and as one does on such occasions, having all kinds of memories of growing up triggered as you come across different things. My brothers and I were deciding, as one does at such a time, it was the same house we'd all grown up in, and where she had lived until a couple of weeks before her passing. What things you want to bring with you and keep with you to remember how you grew up? Perhaps not surprisingly for an academic, for me, it was books, and something which is almost a book. So the first thing was a series of the landmark histories. There's a whole series of books which were written for young teens. These were commissioned by Bennett Cerf at Random House shortly after World War II. And a lot of them were histories with, Robert Rogers and his Rangers, being at D-Day, things like that. But the thing which I remember I tore through as a kid, and what struck me is looking at them, and I hadn't really looked at them at all since, although my kids had read several of them, was looking at it and realizing, my gosh, he really got a fantastic collection of writers. People like the novelist C.S. Forrester, William Shirer, a very well-known journalist who wrote The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. Some of the great World War II correspondents, Richard Tregaskis, who was at Guadalcanal writing about the Battle of Guadalcanal. And these were, I thought, fairly sophisticated books for young teens, and the picture they were giving of the American past was it wasn't rosy necessarily, but it was certainly engaging and patriotic. One of my favorite novels by Kenneth Roberts, a great novelist of the 1930s. His novel Rabble in Arms, which is about the American retreat from Canada and the repulse of the invasion from the north in 1777 and the culminating in the Battle of Saratoga. Another great novel, Walter Edmonds' Drums Along the Mohawk, which was made into a movie with Henry Fonda, and even some more juvenile fiction like Johnny Tremaine, which is by Esther Forbes, which I believe is still in print. And then there was a whole bunch of issues of, thanks, a whole bunch of issues of American heritage from the early 60s. American Heritage is finally back out as kind of a glossy lifestyle sort of magazine. But back then, this was in hardcover. The editor was Bruce Catton, who was in his time the great popular historian of the Civil War. And it had some beautifully printed. It was all kinds of essays about the American past. And it was writers like Eric Larrabee, who wrote Commander-in-Chief, with a great biography of FDR. Stephen Sears, again, a fabulous Civil War historian. Richard Ketchum, again, really I would think you could think of him as the sort of David McCulloch of his generation, as a writer about the American Revolution. And so that it just got me to think about how was my view of this country and my approach to it shaped by this literature, and that in turn led to thinking about the role of patriotic history. Of course, the first point I'd make is none of this was about the classes I took or how I was taught K through 12. Like a lot of kids, I think a lot of this was sort of self-taught or absorbed, and perhaps there's a point there. We shouldn't put everything on the classroom, and we shouldn't put everything on teachers. A lot of it is what we make available to children as they grow up. But I guess one of the things that struck me is that these books and that magazine reflected actually several different eras of fascination with the American past. The 1930s is the great period of a whole bunch of historical novels about the Revolution. Americans at a time of crisis, when a lot of people were not quite sure about what the future of American political institutions were, went back through, I think, the method of fiction to think about the American past. And there have been other such. I'll mention Lincoln's Lyceum speech in 1838, but in the 1830s, there's a whole series of books that come out about the American Revolution, including Bernard Lossing's Field Books, where he kind of went around to all these different battlefields, and there are these wonderful lithographs that I guess he must have made, and interviews with the few surviving Revolutionary War veterans. And these were huge bestsellers back in the 1830s, and it's because that generation is dying out. And of course, that's what Lincoln was responding to. They're the more predictable kinds of waves of fascination with the past. The 1960s were one with the Civil War, centennial of the Civil War. To a lesser degree, the bicentennial of American independence. One of the things that strikes me about these kinds of those books is they were not naively patriotic. They were very thoughtfully patriotic. The novel that I mentioned, Kenneth Roberts' Rabble in Arms, is one in which Benedict Arnold is the good guy. Roberts wrote a number of wonderful novels, Northwest Passage, which is about Robert Rogers and frontier warfare in the 1750s and early 1760s. But he had two novels which deal with Arnold before he committed treason, and paints him, I think not unreasonably actually, as quite a heroic figure. He has another novel which is The American Revolution as Seen Through the Eyes of a Loyalist, which is quite interesting. But the other books, the books in the Landmark series, there's a lot, there's Chief Joseph, and there's the darker side of American history too. Or if I think, one of the things I mentioned in the Atlantic piece is some of the television series of the time. So there's a great television series in 64 and 65 that was made from John F. Kennedy's, actually really Ted Sorensen's, Profiles in Courage. Although Kennedy did, I think, take a strong editorial pen to it. I mean, because Kennedy did care about history. But this was a wonderful television series, which I would love to have somebody reissue. And it is a patriotic series. There's no way you can construe it as anything else. But it usually consists of somebody standing up to a howling mob in defense of American values. And there's some of the lesser-known figures. So one of my favorites was the episode about Oscar Underwood. Nobody's ever heard of. And the reason why you never heard of him, because he was a senator from Georgia who took on the Klan. He had had real possibilities of making it in 1924 as a presidential candidate, and he just couldn't stomach the Klan, which was a really powerful force in the 1920s, and that was the end of his political career. And even where Kennedy himself or the producers of that series disliked the position that somebody took, they painted them as profiles in courage. So my favorite one is Robert Taft, whose foreign policy ideas were terrible. Terrible. I mean, he didn't want us to be in NATO, thought the Nuremberg trials were a terrible idea. But it was you can watch that episode, and it is a sensitive treatment of somebody standing up for principle. Maybe not the principle that you really think should be applied here, but a very deeply American principle, and taking a stand. And then a lot of stuff which is more conventionally kind of heroic, if you will, and fits into a benign reading of the American past. So I think the central point that I would make is patriotic history is a kind of glue to civil society. It's not just about feeling good about who you are as an American. It's about holding the country together. I would refer you again to Lincoln's Lyceum speech in 1838, where he basically says, look, the generation of the Revolution is dying out, and they're gone. So where are the threats to our institutions going to come from? A foreign invader, and he's got a flowery phrase, which I'm not going to try to reconstruct, about, a foreign invader, even with all the wealth of Europe, led by a Bonaparte, could not make a track in the Shenandoah in a trial of 1,000 years, or something like that. But he's worried about the future of American institutions. And it's one of Lincoln's most prescient speeches. He sees something bad coming. And where does he turn back for solace? He goes back to the revolutionary past. And there's a lot of that kind of use to which our history can be put. Well, by and large, I would just say by and large, well, and I would furthermore say that there's a lot of great history that's being written and being consumed that fits that mold. If you think of, just to name three very popular authors, David McCulloch, Ron Chernow, and David Hackett Fisher, they write, I would argue, histories which are patriotic. I mean, they're built on a kind of a deep affection for the United States and for what it stands for, but they are very good histories. These are good historians, and they don't. I don't think these are distorted pictures at all. They are rounded and complex pictures of both people and times, and they're bestsellers. They do just fine. But I think where patriotic history, as it used to be taught, is under attack is more in my world, which is the world of the academy. And the argument that I make in my paper is that the concern that we should have is this sort of thing trickles down. If universities don't have a whole lot of history majors, then you're not going to have a whole lot of really good history teachers. If you don't have a whole lot of good history teachers, that part is going to be missing in the K-12 curriculum, which is more, I think, what, Checker, you're interested in. Now, let me say a little bit about why that's happening. Because it's one of the easiest things in the world to do is to bash the academy. And I, as somebody who's been a professor my whole life long, and has always given as good as he's gotten, and has never actually been persecuted, I want to stand up for it to a limited extent. So why is this happening? Is it that the historical profession is in the hands of a bunch of people who just hate America? And I don't think that's true. But I think there are a number of trends at work which are there. The first, and most of these have to do more, I would say, with the rise of the historical profession rather than ideology per se, although ideology undoubtedly plays a role. I wouldn't want to diminish that. What do I mean? Well, one thing is that there's an awful lot in the current historical profession. There is a tendency to, as they would say, privilege subaltern history. That is to say, history of kind of the lesser figures, less famous people, more in the nature of social history, groups which have been marginalized and haven't gotten their time in the sun. And there, to a certain point, there is a point to be made. There's an argument to be made for that. We know a lot more than we used to know about the history of Native Americans, of what happened to the freedmen after the Civil War. Those were not big parts of the narrative in the 1960s. If you look at a lot of the classic histories of the Civil War that were written then, those groups were not really dealt with in any detail. And there's been a major push into those areas, but in ways which then kind of leave behind, Jefferson and Madison and Washington and people like that. There is an increasing trend in the historical profession to emphasize transnational history rather than national histories. And again, up to a point, that's probably right. For example, somebody like Bernard Bailyn, who was a great historian of early America in his time, was one of the people who first pushed the idea of Atlantic history, that you can't really study the history of the American colonies without understanding that actually they're integrated into a larger Atlantic system with a lot of communication going back and forth. It's actually amazing sometimes how many times these people crossed the Atlantic when that was a pretty harrowing experience. But you have, what you have is often transnational history crowding out national history. There's been, to my mind, a particularly pernicious trend to try to do history without politics, without war, and without diplomacy. It's in the nature of academic fads. It's not that you say, well, you do your thing, I do my thing, let 100 flowers bloom. It does tend to be a bit more my way or the highway. And that, I think, is in some ways the most pernicious trend in the academic world. And then you have the fact that because these professions have been created and this country is so large, the disciplines really become self-sustaining. So they operate within their own ecosystem. And you can have a very comfortable life as a professor writing books that very few people outside your own subspecialty will ever read. And they may be wonderful scholarly monographs. I'm not criticizing that, but you can do all that and never really speak to your fellow citizens, or feel that you're obliged to speak to your fellow citizens. What's the upshot of this? I think that often the danger is not untruth so much as lack of balance. So where this culminates in a book that is in many ways a very good book is there's something called the Oxford History of the United States, which is really a wonderful kind of big, thick volumes that give a history of the United States. There's Robert Middlecoff on the American Revolution, James McPherson, Battle Cry of Freedom, which is still the standard one-volume history of the Civil War. So the most recent one, which is about Reconstruction in the Gilded Age, is called The Republic for Which It Stands by Richard White, very well-known historian. And it is good history. I mean, in that, I think it's carefully researched. What he's describing is true. The only thing is, it's really one-sided. I mean, you come away from that so monumentally depressed about the 1870s, the 1880s, and the early 1890s that you just think the United States must have been doomed at the end of it. And it's not that he's not describing things which aren't real. He is describing things that aren't real. There's, I think, a lack of balance. And I think I will also say there certain kinds of patriotic history can be downright dangerous, and I don't think we should walk away from that. And I think that the example of that is, if you think about it, all the lost cause narrative of the South from the 1880s down through the 60s was a twisted kind of patriotic history, which was false in a very fundamental sense and damaging because it was profoundly untrue about what the causes of the Civil War were and what its outcomes really ended up being. With all that said, I think civic education, which, by the way, all states seem to require like 2 or 3 courses each in their curriculum, is inextricably linked to history and, above all, to patriotic history, a history that is which is driven by a respect and affection for, in this case, what this country is all about. And that patriotic history is essential because otherwise you just come away with process and procedure. A civics course, which just gives you the mechanics of how a bill becomes law, is about as inspiring as one of those IKEA manuals that I can never figure out when I'm putting together furniture. That's all it is. And that's not enough. It's, as I say in the piece, it's not enough to know how the walls were built and how the plumbing was installed in the house that Madison, Washington, and Lincoln built. You need to know who the architects were, what inspired them. You also need to know why it was a remarkable house that they built and why we need to preserve it. I was told to speak for no more than 20 minutes, and so that's what I'm going to do. Let me just conclude on what is, for me, uncharacteristically an optimistic note. Because I am a glass half empty kind of guy, which is why I'm the ideal person to be a vice dean. The first thing is, I think there is some recognition of this issue out there. There's been kind of a running kerfuffle about the advanced placement history standards. I was just looking before I came over here at the revised version of that, which the original set were controversial. I think they were marked by some of the things that we talked about. It's actually pretty good. And in fact, I think the reason why I'm here is because I mentioned, hey, even the Fordham Foundation, a pretty tough bunch of people, think this was not too bad. So I'm a conservative, and temperamentally I'm not inclined to recognize good news when it hits me in the face. But I think occasionally you do have to recognize good news. Secondly, I think it is interesting that you see historians, as you see in some other academic disciplines, beginning to recognize the dangers of being irrelevant to the national debate and national discourse. And it shows up in all kinds of different ways. Political scientists have glommed onto this. That's why those of you who read the Washington Post know there's this column called The Monkey Cage, where people trying to render their research on issues that are of relevance to where we are today into English that other people can understand, and conclusions that might be worthwhile. And whether or not you agree with the substance of any particular article, that is a good thing. I mean, we want professors to think that they're somehow supposed to engage in national debate. History, this is particularly acute because what the historians are realizing is their enrollments are collapsing. And I talk a little bit about that in the paper. And I have colleagues who are themselves historians who've really kind of gone after their own profession. And people are recognizing that the historical profession is getting creamed in the enrollments on campuses. And because higher education itself is going through a major disruption, deans are no longer quite as forbearing about that sort of thing as they used to be. And so that pressure trickles down. And then finally, most controversially, and I'll be delicate about how I do this, I think, as in previous cases in the past, the crisis of the moment has engaged historians. And I conclude the paper with a historian who I don't particularly care for, although I recognize her talents, Jill Lepore, who's a professor of history at Harvard, a very prolific writer, writing for the New Yorker all the time. And I quote from a review of her book about the Tea Party, the history of the Tea Party, by Gordon Wood, who was Bernard Bailyn's top student and is kind of the dean of historians of the American Revolution. And one of the things that Wood wrote about her book is he kind of goes after her because she's just kind of sneering at the way the Tea Party, she wrote this at the time when the Tea Party was coming, just went after her for sneering at the contemporary Tea Party movement for not having a clue about what the Tea Party of the early 1770s was all about. And he argued that it's important to have a history that can meet your society's needs. And so you can say, look, here's how it really happened without being disparaging. Well, I think, that she published that book when her side was actually winning. She's politically, I think, center-left. She's actually got some interesting views on academic freedom, which are more conservative, I would argue. Then you have 2016 and all that falls from that. And she's published a one-volume history of the United States, which is an ambitious thing to do, called These Truths. And even the title is striking. And it is, I would argue, in its own way, a work of patriotic history. In that there is a kind of sense that you're dealing with an exceptional country with a kind of exceptional sort of mission that is shaped by enduring values, which I think everybody in this room would share, and that's important and that's precious. And so I guess the way I'll conclude is, if Jill Lepore can get there, so can everybody else.
Have a seat here.
Okay.
Let me see if I can push this back a little bit. No, I can't. So people will have to move if they can't see us. Thank you. That was great. I resonate in so many levels with this, partly because I grew up with landmark books as a kid, partly because my parents subscribed to American Heritage magazine, and there must have been 4 linear feet of old copies of American Heritage in the bookshelf in the house I grew up in. And then I became a history major in college and had the likes of Bernard Bailyn and Oscar Handlin and Donald Fleming as professors. So I can relate to a lot of this. Thank you very much. You have a kind of triangular trade between history and civics and patriotism going on here. I resonate with it. I think it's absolutely spot on. The patriotism has become a worry for a lot of people in this recent years because they see it turning into nativism and jingoism. And I wonder if we have, if our current politics have caused us to worry that patriotism has actually kind of gone rancid and is something that we should now kind of avoid because it's got this big downside to it.
I don't think so. I figured it's always a safe thing to be with George Orwell. And so I invoked George Orwell's famous essay on nationalism, where he draws a very sharp distinction between nationalism, which he says is classifying people like insects, and patriotism, which is love of one's own. And I think that's a really important distinction. By the way, it's a distinction that works for Americans. I was having dinner with a friend of mine who's a Polish historian, and actually the head of their kind of semi-official foreign policy think tank, so he produces the equivalent of the foreign relations of the United States for Poland. He said, for Poles, nationalism is a good thing. That word has positive vibes. But I think for us as Americans, patriotism is the word to be preferred. I mean, in that respect, I think we should be like Orwell. I mean, nationalism, at least to my ears, has a more belligerent cast to it. I think, at the moment, it's interesting. I don't think. I say this to an audience which is probably largely conservative. It's a good thing for the left to feel patriotic. And it's a good thing for everybody, no matter what their particular views are, to kind of hark back to the American past. and to the values that they find there and they find in our founding documents, and say, yeah, that's who we are, and that's what we're going to stand up for, no matter where you come out on the issues of the day. So I think in a certain way, and this is also why I'm a longer-term optimist about where the country is headed in certain respects, I think in a certain way we're going to get a kind of resurgence of patriotism.
You actually cited several periods where anxiety about the present caused people to reflect back upon the origins. You talked about the 1930s as a time when people look back to where did we come from. You talked about Lincoln in the 1830s, sort of looking back to where did we come from, and now you've got Jill Lepore of all people looking back at a time that she regards certainly as a time of troubles, to where did we come from. This suggests there might be an almost self-correcting element to history properly done.
I think properly done, yeah. I would argue that the more troubling period where we get fascinated with our own past is the 1880s and 1890s, when, as the Civil War generation ages and begins to die off, because life expectancies were less then than they are now, the country begins to process the Civil War, and it process, and you begin to get the preservation of national battlefields. You above all get all those monuments that show up at places like Gettysburg and Antietam. Mm-hmm. You also get the Lost Cause story, mm-hmm. which is a very deliberate attempt to construct the narrative of the Civil War in one way. You also get some very good histories. You get the Century magazine. I don't know if any of you have seen those big battles and leaders of the Civil War. So there's a wonderful collection of reminiscences by key players in the Civil War, published by the Century magazine, which is one of those big, fat 19th century journals that, alas, no longer exist, which really kind of recaptured the moment. And so you came out of that with what was probably which was a romanticized picture of the Civil War, in which everybody gets to be a hero. There are really no villains, and it all ends with a kind of reconciliation, which was, in large measure, phony. So it can be done well, and it can be done really badly.
Looking at the last couple of weeks in Virginia, I might argue we're still processing the Civil War.
We are. Well, look, this is one of the things that's important to teach kids about history, that the past is never really past. It is with us. The Civil War is with us. I mean, the Revolution is with us. World War II is with us. And it's, in our rush to say, okay, everybody's got to do STEM. Everybody has to have standardized tests so we know exactly how good you are. If we're going to stand up to the Chinese, you all have to know math and engineering and God knows what else. We forget, I think, the role of history and a historical sensibility in growing people who can be citizens.
Well, I would personally contend that the most troubled part of the K-12 curriculum for as long as I can remember has been social studies, which is a challenge to get anybody to learn anything resembling real history until maybe the 11th grade U.S. history course that their high school is required by state law to teach them. And that's so often just a textbook and boring as hell. And therefore, you look at the national assessment results of how much do kids know about U.S. history, and the answer is they basically, by 12th grade, don't know anything because the 11th grade course that they had to take was so boring. Contrast that a little bit with the advanced placement saga that you alluded to. I've just finished work on the AP program myself, which has brought me partly back into the fracas over the AP U.S. history. Which turned out to be a really interesting example of a kind of self-correction going on within the College Board, which once they were told that they had kind of, that the content of this framework had tipped, they were willing to take another look at it and try to fix it, actually. And they did. Important thing about high school history is it's for most Americans, until they get the popular historians and buy the David McCullough books or watch a Ken Burns TV show, it's the only uniform U.S. history course that most people ever take. Colleges these days don't require U.S. history of anybody. And in many cases, because I had to check in to a few of them in connection with this book I've been working on, they don't even have a survey course anymore. They only have these kind of subtopical courses.
Yep.
Latino American history in the 1930s, those kinds of courses. So, and even when they do have a survey course, which a lot of them still offer, it's not, of course, required of anybody.
Yeah.
So this history high school moment is very important. But the people teaching it are the people emerging from the universities that you're describing. That's where they learn their history.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a big issue. Now, I mean, that said, high school teachers, I haven't dealt with that many, but I've dealt with some. So I'm on the board of trustees of Fort Ticonderoga up on the juncture of Lake Champlain and Lake George, which is a wonderful site. You should visit it.
Is there a nonprofit organization that runs it?
It is a nonprofit, or it's very unusual. It's not a national park. It's not a state park. It was, again, conservatives should love it. This is private enterprise. It's the Pell family deciding to do something. They can be a lot more creative in their programming as a result than the parks can be. And one of the things that they do, and of course it's a wonderful focal point for American colonial history and the French and Indian War and the Revolution and so on. They put on a whole bunch of workshops for high school teachers, and there's an enormous demand for it. Mm-hmm. On the Revolution, on the 7 Years' War.
Demand by the teachers.
Demand by the teachers.
Yeah.
So I think, in terms of, and again, K to 12 is not really my field at all, but I think instead of tearing our hair out at the kinds of people who are doing it, and I don't have any hair left to tear, I truly believe if you offer things to people that are useful to them and help them in a job that they do want to do well, and I don't think you go into high school teaching unless you were somehow committed to that mission, because it's a harder teaching than I do. It really is. Much harder kind of teaching than I do. If you offer people things that will be helpful, I think we'll find that there's a hunger. So to the extent that we're looking for practical kinds of solutions, I think I would put my money into those kinds of programs. And there are a bunch of them around the country. West Point has something on military history, always wildly oversubscribed. I'm a consultant at the World War II Museum in New Orleans, which is a great museum. They've begun doing these kinds of things. And again, tremendous hunger. I mean, it doesn't hurt that they're in New Orleans. But there is a hunger out there that can be fed in a period when you can't really be sure that the universities are doing what you want them to do.
Well, you illustrate with those examples and also in the paper the kind of popular hunger, not just among teachers, but among Americans for history.
Yes.
These books do sell. These TV shows do get watched. The movies get tickets sold. People do seem to want this. There's sort of commercial and nonprofit sources for it that are responding to the demand. It just doesn't seem to work very well within the formal structure of the public education system itself, with happy exceptions.
Yeah, I think that's right. Although, as I said, I think you can see signs of change in the historical profession.
Well, I hope so, because they are the ones training the teachers, and they are the ones who, for the most part, are writing the textbooks and other materials that are still in.
There are things going on, I think, in that profession, and it's partly because of the challenges that are posed to contemporary universities, which are, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, Stanford. We're not going to go out of business, although we have to change a lot. A lot of other institutions, that is not true. I mean, universities can go out of business. and it has happened, and I think that does tend to focus the minds of people who shape what's on offer.
A footnote on your Fort Ticonderoga point. Somebody pointed out to me the other day that arguably the four most important historical sites in Virginia are all operated by nonprofit organizations. Sure. They are Mount Vernon, Monticello, Montpelier, and Colonial Williamsburg.
Yep.
And every one of them is a private venture, actually. And they all do pretty good programming for both us walking in and for people like teachers who want to come for the programs.
And I think there are a lot of bright spots that are like that. That it's worth figuring out what is the secret sauce that they've got.
What is the secret sauce
that works? And the truth is, with good leadership and a vision, you can draw people in. I mean, when I was growing up, and when you were growing up, both of us back in the dark ages, it was just sort of the standard thing. You throw the kids in the back of the car, you'd all squeeze in, no air conditioning, and nobody could afford to fly to Europe or whatever, so you'd drive, to upstate from Boston or something like that. And that's how tourism came to these sites. That no longer works that way. These are destinations that people have to want to go to. And the successful places, Mount Vernon is a great example. Williamsburg has actually also been pretty good. Museum of the American Revolution, I think, is doing a pretty good job too. Is they've really given thought about how are we going to pull people in?
Because we're competing, we have to pull people in. We've got one more question, then we're going to open this up for all of you. So think about what you'd like to ask Elliot. It's Washington, so the federal role question invariably comes up. NEH, when it was led by people like Bill Bennett and Lynn Cheney, worked on U.S. history and did things for high school teachers. Until a few years ago, there was a teaching American history program at the U.S. Department of Education that gave grants to states and districts, championed by the late Robert Byrd and Lamar Alexander. Byrd's dead, Lamar's retiring.
Yep.
Is there I'm not aware of any current federal thing that attempts to advance the correct teaching or even interesting teaching of American history or civics. Is there a role to be found here, or should we just not even try?
Well, there probably is, although, I think whenever anybody wants the federal government to do something, anything, like anything, you should always ask yourself, will I feel the same way when the other side, whoever the other side is, gets into power? Because they will get into power, and they will use exactly the same authorities that you just gave them to do whatever it is that they want to do. If you feel comfortable with that, then maybe it's okay. I think the kinds of NEH programs you're talking about, of course, those are great. Having the Department of Education serve as a resource and give grants, I think that's good. Putting the federal government in charge of education,
No.
Not a good idea. I'll tell you what I think the federal government should do. Like I said, I'm a conservative, so I believe in conserving things. So, I really like the idea of the national parks being really well funded, including all kinds of historical sites. And that actually is a very important thing. It doesn't cost a whole lot of money. I don't like the idea that, the people at places like Gettysburg have to figure out how we're going to bring in enough money to pay for the things we want to do to preserve that hallowed ground.
And you don't think David Rubenstein should have to pay for all this himself?
No. And so I think that role in in preservation and making these things available to the American people and in ways that are compelling and that can be used for in a variety of ways to bring people in, that's actually in some ways the most important thing they can do.
Good. Thank you. We're open. Who's got go ahead. Please say who you are.
Hi, my name's Christina. I'm with the College Fix. So I know that you said the biggest problem is with the historical profession and not necessarily ideology, but what ideology would you say is behind the push to teach U.S., the subtopical courses versus U.S. history? Are we talking about globalism, multiculturalism?
I think it's, there's some piece of it which is ideological, which is, we're going to stand up for the forgotten man or woman. That's an old theme. But some parts of it are driven by actually professional it's important to realize they're professional imperatives. And the professional imperatives are to be, a microscopic expert on something that you can really leverage and say, this is my little field, and boy, do I really know it. And the professions, as they've become more inward-looking, have tended to reward that. And we see that in many areas. It's not just in history. You see it in political science, which has in some ways been less ideological, and history has been more ideological. But that imperative is there, and because of the way universities have been resourced and so on, you can get away with that, and you can get prizes that will help you advance professionally and that are lucrative with really narrow expertise. And this is something I wrestle with as a vice dean. Actually, I just kind of gave a little oration at a meeting. So the incentive structure in universities is in some ways profoundly screwed up. We talked about faculty being able to buy themselves out of teaching with a research grant, which is a standard procedure. And I said, folks, my view is there may be times when we give people leave from teaching to finish a particular project, and I get that, or there's some sort of other extraordinary circumstance. But the idea that it is a reward not to teach is just, to me, that's anathema, because we're here to teach. That's what it means to be any kind of teacher, whether you're a professor or a high school teacher, or I don't care what. And so there's but that sort of thing is the norm. And to the extent that teaching is viewed as a burden, rather than as a challenge and potentially a joy, we've got a problem. And there's another fundamental problem. Again, as a vice dean, I've got violent opinions about this in terms of our incentive structures. We incentivize people who publish. We don't incentivize people who teach. And that's not an ideological problem. I've got liberals and I got conservatives, and they've both been incentivized the wrong way. And so those are some of the more fundamental things I think universities have to think about.
I just want to add that the subtopical approach to history is not brand new. I mean, 50-some years ago, I took a course from Oscar Hamlin called American Social History, and it was about immigrants and women and it wasn't about wars and generals and presidents and Supreme Court decisions. It was about what happened to ordinary people when they, for example, came to America. So this was going on quite a while ago and in good hands, competently taught, and arguably even a survey course of American social history. Okay, who else? Yes, sir. Mike's coming to you.
One way to teach a patriotic history.
Who are you?
Steve Lipson from Vanderbilt. One way to teach a patriotic history while still recognizing being critical is to talk about the founding ideals and say that things might be bad, but they've been worked to improve, abolishing slavery. So I guess two questions that come from that is, to what degree in patriotic history is there room for being critical of the founders and the Constitution and their motives or parts of it that aren't good? And the second related question is there, to what degree does patriotic history depend on a belief that things are inevitably getting better? There could be setbacks, but things are always leading toward improvement.
So let me answer the second one. I think actually it's not patriotic history if you don't realize that you might have to fight for it. That's something that we that is missed. I, at one point, after a recent event, was talking to a bunch of my students who were quite rattled. And I said, well, remember what Benjamin Franklin said when he leaves the Constitutional Convention and nobody knows what's in the Constitution. And the crowd says, what kind of government have you given us, Mr. Franklin? And the answer is, a republic, if you can keep it. Which means he didn't have faith that necessarily we would be able to. That's the challenge. And so I think a sort of a patriotic mindset says, no, there's something precious and valuable here, and it's not guaranteed to you. It has to be, and that's, in a way, that was Lincoln's message as well. You got to win it in each generation. The first question is I think maybe I want to carry it in perhaps a somewhat different direction than you might think. I think the problem with intellectuals in general, of left or right, and academics, and people like me, I mean, I've been lucky, I've had the opportunities to serve in policy-making positions, is you have no idea how, they have no visceral idea of how hard government is, how hard it is to do things. And this is a, it's a built-in problem for military historians. We know how the battle turned out. And so it is a lot easier for us to say, General so-and-so really screwed up at this juncture in the battle because, we're making that with the full knowledge of what happened in the past, and we're comfortable and at leisure, and he's making it when he's hearing the screams of the wounded and hasn't slept and all that. And so the challenge for good historians, and there are many great historians who've done this, is to recreate the past, but exercise judgment that has a sense of proportion. And I think that's in a way the challenge with the founders. I mean, for me, Thomas Jefferson. Forgive me, a limousine liberal if ever there was one. Spouts all these high-flown sentiments. You look at how he treated his slaves. It's horrible. It's really horrible, including breaking up families and selling people and, quite apart from taking advantage of them sexually. Was he nonetheless a great man? Yeah, I would say so, because I have some sense of, what you might expect of somebody of his background in his generation, and kind of understand that you can have somebody who can express noble sentiments in a noble way and still fall very far short of them himself. So I think it's actually a good thing for students to have to wrestle with, okay, Washington was a slave owner. What do I think about that? And it's, history has so many functions to it. One of them is teaching people judgment. I mean, when I think about what it is I try to teach my students, part of what I'm trying to teach them is judgment. And history is a wonderful way of developing judgments of, this person in this circumstance, why did they do what they do? And putting everything into its context, what do I think? I think when you do that, you say, Declaration of Independence is an astounding document. Constitution of the United States is an astounding document. The governmental system that we've created is extraordinary. Does that mean that it wasn't filled with lots of flawed people? No, lots of flawed people. Lots of things you might kind of wish had been constructed differently? Sure. But to the extent that to breed citizens, you want people who can exercise judgment, and part of judgment is a sense of perspective.
On that excellent note, we are going to thank you, Elliot, and we're going to take a 5-minute break before the second half.
All right. Well, that was really fun, that first half. Thank you so much, Elliot and Checker, for that. I'm Mike Petrilli. I'm the president of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute and a visiting fellow here at the Hoover Institution, and so excited to get to moderate a talk by Yuval Levin. First, I should say, Elliot and Checker, I know you guys are doing a lot of reminiscing about some of the great histories for kids back from your youth, and I am definitely going to check out the Landmark series and see if I can still get it in print for my young boys. But I do want you to know there's some great stuff out there today that's worth checking out as well. From time to time, I like to write about stuff that's out there on the market for kids and in schools. And if you haven't seen it, Nathan Hale's Hazardous Tales, fantastic books on U.S. history. They are graphic novels. And they're hilarious. And I will say, though, if you have young children, be a little careful with the Donner Party book that he did, because that may lead to some difficult questions. Got in quite a bit of trouble from the preschool on that one. There's also, there is incredibly enough, some really good stuff on YouTube these days also. The PBS Kids show, Liberty's Kids, you can now get on YouTube, fantastic series. And there's also this great channel I like called Extra History. So check it out. We've gone beyond just books. Pretty exciting. Well, it's my great honor to introduce Yuval Levin, who all of you know, I'm sure, one of the leading writers and thinkers of our generation. He is the editor of National Affairs. He's also the Hertog Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, senior editor of the New Atlantis, contributing editor to National Review and the Weekly Standard. Oh, we got to take that out. Oh, it's so sad. Formerly the publication, formerly known as the Weekly Standard. He is the author of several great books. The most recent one is The Fractured Republic, Renewing America's Social Contract in the Age of Individualism. But the book of his that I liked the best was The Great Debate, which I would certainly urge you to check out. I've gotten to see a draft of his talk. It is fantastic. It's difficult and challenging for those of us involved in education reform, but incredibly important as well. So Yuval, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it, Mike. I appreciate the introduction, and I'd second your recommendation. I've just been reading the Nathan Hill series, the book on Lafayette with my daughter, which also has some things that are not quite suitable for preschool, but nonetheless, really worth your while. I'm very grateful for the chance to be part of this series and to follow Elliot Cohen, who I admire enormously, and all the more so in the past few years. I want to take up a subject that is related to his subject, and that speaks to the question of where our education debates are headed, which isn't really obvious now. Policy debates about primary and secondary education are, I think, oddly disoriented at this point, and I want to offer you a kind of slightly outsider's perspective on what they look like and where it seems to me they might be going, very much related to the question of patriotism and civic education and related questions. At almost any point in the 1990s or 2000s, it would have been pretty easy to say what these education debates were about and what reformers were trying to achieve. Higher scores on standardized tests of math and reading skills were very often at the center of those debates and a central purpose of reformers. Whether they were understood as ways of imposing accountability on teachers and administrators, or as ways of measuring racial gaps in educational achievement, or as a strategy to help America produce students and workers that could compete in the world, where scores were too low, there would be a debate between the left and right flanks of that reform coalition about whether more competition or more money for public schooling could be more helpful. But that debate often happened within the framework of a broadly bipartisan coalition that focused especially on quantifiable achievement scores. That coalition had opponents on its left and on its right, but it involved the leading education experts across the political spectrum, and a fair number of leading politicians of both parties were willing to play ball. That era did achieve some meaningful improvements, even if they were modest improvements, in American education. Test scores did increase some, especially early in that period. The charter school movement is stronger for it. The idea of accountability for teachers and administrators is certainly more widely accepted as a result of it. And there's also, I think, a more equitable distribution of public education funding within states as a result of some of what happened in the course of that period. There's a fair bit for both the left and the right to appreciate in these accomplishments. But that era of the Reform Coalition also exacted some real costs. Above all, it made American education policy awfully clinical and technocratic, sometimes blinding us to some of the deepest questions that are really at stake in education, social and moral and cultural and political questions that cannot be separated from how we think about teaching and learning. That's meant less of a focus on public schooling as a source of solidarity in American life, which was once a powerful theme for the left in particular. It's meant less of an emphasis on character formation and civic education, which once was fundamental to the right's way of thinking about schooling. But whatever its costs and whatever its benefits, I think the era of education reform, of the bipartisan education reform coalition, seems now to be over, at least for a while. The coalition broke down from both directions. The fight over Common Core drained it of some of the energy on the right, as the case for accountability, which had begun as a predicate for school choice, came to be identified by many people instead, rightly or wrongly, with an effort to consolidate or homogenize American education. And meanwhile, the resurgence of the teachers' unions, among other causes, undermined the Reform Coalition from the left. And the intense polarization of our political culture has increasingly made the kind of bipartisanship that characterized that coalition impossible to sustain. So that the reform era that lasted from the early 1990s through the beginning of the 2010s is probably effectively over. What would follow it as an immediate political matter is probably at first at least going to be a period of gridlock and dysfunction. We can just look around, and not only at education to get a sense of why that is. That's simply where our policy debates are now. But what will follow the reform era as an intellectual matter in the work of education reformers and as a preparation for the next constructive phase of education policy, whenever it might come, is, I think, a more interesting question. Frustrated by the collapse of the Reform Coalition, but also liberated from its constraints, the right and the left will probably take somewhat different directions in education policy thinking in the coming years. And for that reason, I think it's still useful to think about education policy and politics in terms of left and right. In fact, it might be that the deepest differences between the most intellectually coherent forms of the American left and right actually emerge most clearly around questions of education, and not by coincidence. And for each camp, the concerns that were put aside for the sake of working together in the Reform Coalition seem likely now to be those that come to the fore. So I want to think with you a little bit about what that might mean, and what it might mean for the right in particular. What did the right put aside in that period of bipartisan Reform Coalition efforts, and what might it now pick up? Some reformers on the right would argue that school choice itself was put aside to make bipartisanship possible, and it's true that, especially at the national level, accountability was separated from choice, and the latter was sometimes sacrificed for the former. Margaret Spellings was famously willing to leave private school choice behind in her negotiations with Democrats early in the George W. Bush years. But in the states and at the local level, the movement for parental control did see real progress in that period, and both charter schooling and private school choice remained near the center of the conservative education agenda. To see what conservative educational priorities were really put aside in that period, we would have to really put ourselves outside of the accountability and achievement framework to remind ourselves that the emphasis on accountability was actually itself a kind of concession to begin with. What really couldn't be talked about as much in those decades was the role of schooling in the molding of the souls of rising citizens, rather than just of the minds of future workers. Both civic education and character education were sometimes pushed to the side for the sake of more technocratic notions of the purpose of schooling, notions more in line with the economic logic of our meritocracy, but less in line with the civic ideals that underlie our republic. If we really want to look beyond the framework of the achievement scores agenda, and if we want to consider what conservatives could bring to the table now that's been forgotten for a while, we would need to look not just to the conservative wing of the Reform Coalition, but to the core of conservative thinking itself, and the essential role that it ascribes to culture, to moral formation, and therefore to education, more fully understood. To see what that could mean, we should ask a couple of questions that seem almost as foreign to this moment in our politics as the idea of earnest policy innovation itself. They're questions that could hardly be more important to the right in the age of Trump and after it, but that don't come naturally to us just now. Questions like, what really is conservatism? What does it actually have to offer our actual society? There are obviously a lot of ways that we could go about answering these kinds of questions and distinguishing the left from the right. But for our purposes, I think there's one particular approach that could help to highlight the implications of these differences for education in particular. The left and right both have something to teach. Each wants to make sure that our society doesn't take something for granted, and so each tries to remind the rising generation of something that it might otherwise neglect. But each has something distinct in mind on that front. The left wants to be sure that we don't take the persistence of injustices in our society for granted and so leave them unaddressed, that we see the ways in which the strong oppress the weak, that we take them seriously, that we don't walk by them and pretend they don't exist. A huge amount of progressivism's cultural and intellectual energies are directed to this really fundamentally educational purpose. The right wants to be sure that we don't take social order for granted, that we see the ways in which our civilization protects us and enriches us and elevates us, that we never imagine that this is easy or natural, and never forget that if we fail to sustain this achievement, we will all suffer for it. A huge amount of conservatism's cultural and intellectual energies are directed to that fundamentally educational cause. These two different sets of concerns suggest that the left and the right begin from different assumptions, different basic assumptions, even about the human person and society, and seeing some of those could help us think a little bit more clearly about how we all think differently about education. Conservatives tend to see the human person as a fallen and imperfect thing, prone to excess, maybe to sin, always in need of self-restraint, of moral formation. This fundamentally gloomy conception of the human person sets conservatives apart both from libertarians and from progressives, and it sits at the core of most conservative thinking about society and politics. It leads us, to begin with, to low expectations of human affairs and away from utopianism. Conservatives expect the most profound, most basic problems that human beings confront to recur in every generation because they're intrinsic to the human person. They're a function of our permanent limitations. We can acknowledge them, we can counterbalance them, we can try to accommodate them, but they can never really go away. And the fact that these limits are inherent also leaves most conservatives persuaded that the experiences of different generations will not be fundamentally different from one another. As some people have put it, human nature has no history. That leaves conservatives not only resistant to the lure of utopia, but also a lot more concerned about the possibility of social and cultural degradation than eager for enduring progress. Progress is simply impossible if we don't take care to preserve the preconditions for it. Regardless of how much intellectual or material progress any society might make, every new child that enters that society will still join it with basically the same native intellectual and biological equipment as any other child born in any other place at any other time in human history. Raising those children from scratch to the level of their societies is a prerequisite for any form of progress, and if we fail to do it, we will lose both our inheritance and our prospects. That's a critical reason why conservatives care so much about culture. And that same assumptions, rooted in those low expectations, also often leaves conservatives impressed with enduring, successful social institutions. The fallen character of man means that left to itself, the default condition of the human race is just more likely to be miserable than happy, and that failure is more likely than success. And so we're much more thankful for success in society than we are even outraged by failure. Progressives, I think, tend to feel differently because their expectations, implicitly at least, are a lot higher. They assume that social order might be the easy part, and that any deviation from equality or justice have to be intentional results of acts of malice by people who are strong in our society and choose to use their power to oppress the weak. That difference of expectations is at the center of a lot of our most divisive political debates. It shapes how conservatives and progressives understand the nature and the sources of the problems that our society faces. As the economist Arnold Kling has noted in an important book called The Three Languages of Politics that I recommend to all of you, this means that conservatives tend to view political controversies as involving a confrontation between civilization and barbarism, while progressives look at the same controversies as involving a confrontation between oppressor and oppressed. Think about how people on the right and the left talk about immigration, for example, or about urban policing, almost any of the most intensely debated cultural and political controversies that we face. You'll get a sense of what that kind of framework could help us to see. And the implications of all that for education are enormous. It means that conservatives place heavy emphasis on sustaining the institutions necessary for moral formation and for social peace, while progressives tend to emphasize liberating individuals from the oppressive burdens of a social order that too often is steeped in injustice. That points not so much toward different curricular choices in character or civic education as toward a much greater emphasis on both of those things on the right, and an inclination on the left to discount them or avoid them or to replace them with an ideal of education as liberation from injustice. An emphasis on the quantifiable in education, which has been the organizing principle of the Reform Coalition for more than 2 decades, tends to downplay both of these ways of thinking about curricular content and emphasis. That's not to say that this has been a period devoid of struggles about these questions, and it's also not to say that character education has been entirely absent from the national debate. An emphasis on character has been important to the success of some of the most prominent choice experiments and charter programs that serve disadvantaged students, for instance. But in putting accountability and achievement gaps and international competitiveness at the forefront, the Reform Coalition has de-emphasized the formation of students as human beings and citizens. This helped, I think, for a while to shield the politics of K-12 education from some of the very worst ravages of our increasingly intense and polarized culture war, at least until recently. But it's also kept out of bounds some essential tools and ideas that could play important roles in strengthening American education, including in closing achievement gaps and in helping students learn the basics. Any idea of education that is not connected to an idea of formation, of habituation in virtue, of inculcation in tradition, even veneration of the high and the noble, is unavoidably impoverished at some level. And in the wake of the collapse of the Education Reform Coalition, conservatives are well positioned to help American education become a little less impoverished in that particular sense. That doesn't mean that we could all agree on a precise curriculum in these areas, or that we need to use the state to impose it, but it does mean that it's now incumbent on us to make education policy debates less technocratic, and so more suited to the particular kinds of challenges that our country confronts now. I think that's a key point to close with. The last few years of our politics have shown us that our country is living through a serious social crisis. Many Americans are alienated from our core institutions, distrustful of them, and we seem to have less and less recourse to any foundation of mutual commitments. At the same time, an epidemic of isolation and estrangement is breaking down the lives of millions of people, leaving them disconnected from sources of belonging and meaning. And we're witnessing the loss of a common civic vocabulary, which is just leaving us less capable of defining our Americanness in positive rather than just negative terms. These are obviously connected problems, and they relate to the tendency of all of our major institutions to shirk the task of moral formation, often in favor of moralistic performance and virtue signaling. It should be obvious that there's a crucial role for schools in addressing some of these problems, even if it's not obvious exactly what it would mean to play that role effectively and responsibly. The question should be how, not whether, to place a greater emphasis on character and on civics in American education. That's partly because education is inherently formative, so that to keep character and civics out of the equation is implicitly to tell students that they don't matter. If we organize our schools around the premise that math and reading scores are what education is about, we effectively tell our children that math and reading are the essence of what the civilization they're inheriting has to offer them. And we can't really believe that's true. But there's another, less obvious reason why a formative idea of education would have to be at the center of a broader social renewal. Key to the reason why our mediating institutions, institutions of family and community, religion and civic life, have lost some of their ability to bring us together, to shape our character for flourishing, is that they've lost some of their practical purposes in our lives. The logic of the welfare state and the logic of the market economy have both expanded their reach in the past half century so that between them they now penetrate absolutely every crevice of our common life. For good and bad, that has meant that many Americans are just less dependent on sources of help in the family and the community that might demand something of them in return, or might offer us a place and a connection. And that's meant that local civic and charitable groups, religious institutions, and fraternal organizations just have less to do, and therefore have fewer ways to attract people out of isolation and into community. Both the character of modern markets and the character of modern governments have enervated our traditional mediating institutions. Those kinds of institutions and the connections that they offer us are still essential to our building relationships and attachments, though. They're vital to our psychic and social well-being, but we can't expect them to remain strong if that's all they do for us. If we don't need them for practical purposes, their ability to form and to support us will inevitably wither. And we simply don't rely on many of our civic and communal institutions as we used to. But schools are an exception. They remain essentially local institutions, and we still need them to perform an absolutely necessary practical function, educating the young. That means they can still successfully play a further formative function, and to a degree that few other mediating institutions can. So we have to demand that they take that formative role seriously, and we should put it at the center of how we think about education. Now, that obviously all adds up to a controversial understanding of the purpose of primary and secondary education, and one that could tend to fan the flames of our culture wars. Whether we like it or not, the next phase of conservative education policy thinking is going to need to be willing to do that, not to the exclusion of emphasizing core math and reading competency or accountability, but alongside them. Over the past few decades, our approach to education became too technocratic, but in the coming years, conservatives are going to need to find appealing, responsible ways to return to our roots and remind ourselves and the country of just what children need from schooling and what an ideal of education more thoroughly rooted in an ideal of human flourishing could have to offer. Thanks.
Like I said, wow. So much to unpack here. And I think we're all going to need to have a chance to get to read what you wrote. You went so fast and packed so many important
you told me
ideas.
20 minutes. And
you did, no, and that's talking fast is one way to do it. No, really important. And as I said, challenging to those of us who have been involved in this education reform movement and who get called technocratic at times. There's no test I never, I like every test of it.
Some of my best friends are technocrats.
All right, thank you. But important to hear this as well. And also, Chuff, this question, do we have to admit that the bipartisan education reform movement is over? And I think some of us are still wrestling with that and don't want to necessarily believe that, certainly at the state level. But I think certainly a strong argument that that is what we have to reckon with at this point. A couple big questions I want to get into in our conversation, and then we'll open it up. And it's really when you talk about the next phase of thinking on the conservative side, you paint this picture that there is something that is a conservative form of education. And I want to understand better what that looks like for you. We can talk about little kids or bigger kids. And let me read a couple of the quotes before you answer that, as you define conservatism. And by the way, I know you clearly haven't been trained in branding and marketing for the conservative movement here. We say, conservatives tend to see the human person as a fallen and imperfect being, prone to excess and to sin, and ever in need of self-restraint and moral formation. That's a real, wow, it's kind of a bummer there, but okay. Conservatives place heavy emphasis on sustaining the institutions necessary for moral formation and social peace, while progressives tend to emphasize liberating individuals from oppressive burdens of a social order steeped in injustice. So progressive education wants to liberate the student to be himself or herself, while conservative education wants to form the student to be better suited to the responsibilities of citizenship. So liberation versus formation. And then any idea of education that is not connected to an idea of formation, and habituation in virtue, inculcation in tradition, veneration of the high and noble is unavoidably impoverished. So say more for, you've got a preschooler at a preschool level, an elementary school level. What does this look like?
Well, let me say, the notion of conservative education isn't quite what I would prescribe. I think what we need is a different role for conservatives in our broader education debates. We need a change of emphasis and a greater emphasis on the fact, and I think it's a fact, that schools are formative, whether we like it or not. And so whatever it is we do with schooling will be formative of the character of our children. So that when we think about curriculum, when we think about the nature of these institutions, we have to ask ourselves, what kind of character is it forming in our children? And the fact is, a lot of our institutions now, not just educational institutions, are in the process of escaping their essentially formative obligations and responsibilities. In a lot of institutions, we find people who want to think about those institutions as performative, as ways to be seen, as ways to perform. I mean, if you spend time with members of Congress, as I do, and I don't recommend it, you find people who are looking for a stage. And I think we have to be very careful about letting that kind of thing happen in education. We have to see that these are fundamentally formative institutions. What that means as a practical matter, I think conservatives have to insist that schools do teach character and civics. And you asked the question about younger kids and older kids. I think in a sense, character and civics are connected if you think about them as you move up the school ages. You have to begin from fundamental character education, thinking about responsibility, thinking about simple things like kindness and honesty. And look, I've got a 6-year-old and an 8-year-old. You can only do this so much. You're not going to get that far. But I think if you communicate to children by virtue of spending time in school on these things, by thinking about it through stories and examples, that this is important, right? You shouldn't expect too much out of it, but you should expect that they value this and they see that the adults they trust and who love them prioritize this and care about it. It's very important for our educational system to communicate that essential character matters. And as you move up the school ages, that needs to be connected to an idea of what it is to be an American and connected to civics in a direct way, so that when we think about virtue, we then think about that as it's embodied in the lives of important men and women in our history, of events in our history, thinking about what it is to be an American by thinking about what it's been to be an American. And I think we have to make sure that these kinds of questions are in the debate, that we are there making the case for them. And if people want to argue against civics and character education, let them put those arguments on the table and let parents hear that and let citizens hear that and let's let that be debated. Our education debates have, to too great an extent, been about how do we improve math and reading scores. We do need to improve math and reading scores, but our children are not just readers and calculators. They're human beings, and I think it is very important that we think about the question of how do we help them be better human beings too.
You know, and I feel like when you listen to a lot of what you said, I can imagine that there'd be still wide agreement, both at the elite level and at the local level. Parents and educators would say, well, of course we should teach kids to be good people and to learn American history. And yet, if you really push on it, I guess the question is, if we start to get more normative, we want to teach them to be, quote, a good person, as you said.
These things
then you have to start to define what that means, that there is good and there is evil, or at least bad. And then that's where you start to get into the culture work.
I think this does come down to arguing about curriculum, at the level of a school board, at the level of a school. And yeah, those debates can be contentious. They're going to be contentious. Our education system is very decentralized, right? As conservatives, we're used to complaining about how overly centralized it is, and there is something to complain about. But in fact, if you step back from American education, it is actually very decentralized, and educational debates are very local debates. And so I think that emphasizing these kinds of priorities is going to result in different things in different places, but that's fine. As long as a general matter, we as a society are having a conversation with one another about what we want to teach our children when it comes to character and civics, I think we're already in a better place, even if the outcomes of those are not exactly what I would want to see or exactly what you would want to see. It makes a difference to put this at the center.
But let's talk about that, right? I mean, it's certainly true that in many parts of America, you've got now this geographic clumping where, you know, a lot of red people in one place and a lot of blue in others, but most places there's still, you know, some diversity of political and ideological opinion. And so you're going to have people who are, you're going to have maybe these fierce debates at the local level. And how do you resolve them? How do you decide if you're going to teach a more liberal or a more conservative curriculum?
Look, oftentimes at the end of the day, it's going to be a vote of the school board, and a lot of people are going to be unhappy about what comes out of it. I think it is still better to have that argument and to have that vote and to take a small step than it is to do what I think too often happens now, which is we say there is a state requirement to teach civics in the 11th grade. Is somebody doing that? Yeah, we're doing that, and that's it. There's not much of an argument about what is involved in that, what it actually means, what specifically, what books are we reading, what questions are we taking up. I would just put more responsibility on the shoulders of school boards and therefore of parents to take up these questions. Not everybody's going to do it. Not everybody goes to school board meetings, God knows. But those who do should see this as one of the things they're trying to argue about to a greater degree. And again, this is really a difference of emphasis. I'm not suggesting a revolution.
Right. You know, one solution to this would be school choice, to say, okay, well, this is one reason why we need to allow parents to choose a school that fits their own values and their own approach to these questions. And so then you can have a school that's more progressive and a school that's more conservative, and everybody gets what they want. I mean, are you making, in effect, a backdoor argument for school choice?
Well, not simply. You know, Mike, I'm a great believer in public education. It's not always the best option for parents, and there have to be other options for parents, and I'm a great believer in school choice, too. But I think there's real value, inherent value, in the public school system, and we should fight for that system. I do not think it makes sense for parents who are concerned about these priorities to escape that system, to leave children whose parents are not as engaged trapped in that system, and to try to build something better just for their own kids. I think we have to have an argument together about what it is that we want our children to be taught and why and how. And where it's possible, you know, we should try to stay in these systems. Look, not everybody's lucky enough to be in a place where that makes sense. My kids are in public schools, but we live in a place where that's a very good education. In many places, that's just not true, and we should make sure that parents have other options. But I don't think that we should encourage people as a general matter or try ourselves to just escape those systems and leave people trapped in them who don't have the options we have.
Really interesting. I don't think these are words that have been said at the Hoover Institution very often, and yet here I am, a public school parent myself. You did say in your talk, you said that conservatives tend to be impressed with, quote, successful social institutions, and we care a lot about these mediating institutions and this praise for public schools, and yet I mean, you don't hear that from conservatives very often, to talk about public schools in the same category as we talk about some of those other institutions in our society. Why is that?
Well, look, I think part of it is the mood that we're in as conservatives in general now. You know, we conservatives love to say that we love the Constitution, and we do, but then we talk about how much we hate the courts and the presidency and the Congress, and that is the Constitution. That is the entire Constitution.
That was the pessimism thing again.
So, you know, I think we have to work hard to see that a lot of our institutions are well worth investing ourselves in and believing in. And I do think that public schools in America are an enormous social achievement. They're troubled, and there are a lot of things about them that need to be repaired. But in a lot of places, in most places, they are organically emergent local institutions. They look like the community. They are shaped by the community and by its values, and they're what we want. They're not what we should run away from. Maybe that's not true in every place where, you know, people who work in think tanks and universities live, but it is true in a lot of places. And I don't think we should be planting the premise that the way to approach these is to give up on them and run away.
All right, let's get the audience into this conversation here. Raise your hand, and if you're watching over the internet, send me a tweet at Michael Petrilli or at our hashtag #Ed2020, and I will try to include that in the conversation. Raj Vinakota, let's start here with, and then another, and Ashley, yes, go ahead. We'll start with Ashley, yeah.
Oh, hi.
Tell us who you are and where you're from.
I'm Ashley Berner, Johns Hopkins. Do you think that there is room in the American political space for the kind of model that most democracies have for their school systems, that is pluralistic, in which they do public education is construed as many things with diverse delivery, whether it's Jewish education or Inuit education or homeschooling, and yet at the same time, there's academic accountability for real content knowledge? Is there room for that kind of middle path between the libertarian and state orientation here?
Yeah, look, I sure hope so. I mean, I think that is a better path than the options that we've given ourselves. And I do think there's room within the structure of our political institutions and of our political traditions and political history for that kind of approach to education. So, yeah, I think there's more room to think about what we mean by public education rather than accepting a kind of, you know, radical dualism that just says that's public education and everything else is private education, and now you choose. You know, again, I think it's possible to make different choices in different places in our society about that kind of question. We have a very diverse society, and we should have a diversity of options for people, including options in public education. Sure.
Raj?
Raj Vinakota, someone who's been in the education reform field for 20 plus years and agree with much of what you said. Part of that movement was also about moving from inputs to outputs. And a lot of what you are suggesting as the approach is inputs. Let's change the curriculum. What's the mechanism to determine whether or not that has been done well when we talk about the kinds of things you're suggesting?
I don't know, Raj, kind of a technocratic question there.
No, that's great. Look, I think it's a very good and important question. It's a challenging question, not only in education policy, right? When we think about character formation for our children, how do we measure that? I don't know, our grandchildren? It's not easy to say. And I don't think we're going to have a test that tells us how that's going. So I do think that at some level, part of what I'm arguing for also does push back against this premise that everything that education does should be measurable in the near term. That kind of once it's in your head, you should be able to put it on the test, and then we know you got it. That's very important. It's very important, especially when we think about math and reading and other competencies. But character formation is a long-term process. It's about gradual exposure to models of the good over time that shapes and changes your character. And I just wouldn't expect to be able to measure that on a test. I think you measure that with the kinds of adults you create. And, you know, that's a challenge. That's a problem. That means along the way, we just don't know how it's going. But, you know, if you're a parent, you know what that feels like. Along the way, we don't know how it's going, that's for sure.
You know, Yuval, there's often in our world, we talk about character education, and you'll hear people talk about, for example, what KIPP has done over the years, which is to very much focus on helping kids figure out what some have called performance character. I think David Brooks might have coined that. And it's about teaching kids things like grit and perseverance and the kinds of personal habits that will help them succeed as they make their way through school and into college and the workforce and beyond. All good stuff, but somewhat distinct from what you might call moral character, which is more about not so much helping yourself, but helping others, you know, telling the truth, doing the right thing even when nobody's noticing, right? And is it fair to say that, you know, maybe it's going to be easier to get people around the performance character stuff, sometimes we call it social and emotional skills also, than it is to get people comfortable with the notion of moral character?
Sure, I think that's very true, but I wouldn't separate those quite so starkly. I think what KIPP does is very closely related to moral formation and to character building. And it also can lead very naturally toward a certain kind of building up of civic cohesion. Those schools build very strong communities, and they are communities built around a certain sense of the good that's very clear and very stark for students. So, I think building up character is at the same time about building up those kinds of skills, resilience and discipline and commitment, and building up a sense of what all those are for. So, if that's an easier way in, I think we can start there, because that is a way forward toward a kind of moral formation.
Hi, Susan Sclafani, one of the technocrats, originally with No Child Left Behind.
Now, Yuval was in the George W. Bush administration, too. I should have said that, so he's not completely innocent.
I was in healthcare. You want to talk technocrats? I can show you some technocrats.
I really wanted to I was going to follow up on Mike's point, too. The Aspen Institute Commission just came out with its reports on social, emotional, and academic development, which includes a focus on character. And I'm on the board of character.org, which is very much focused on character development and schools demonstrating a community focused on character. Have you been able to look at those reports and see whether they would fit in with your view of what's needed?
Yeah, I haven't seen the new Aspen Commission report. I think a lot of what happens on that front very much fits in. As I say, I think this is about emphasis. And so the very fact of talking about these questions and asking ourselves what we mean by these very broad and inherently vague terms is enormously important in moving the conversation in that direction. So absolutely, I think a lot of that is vital and useful. There's also some important work being done on the civic education side. There are a lot of people trying to develop various kinds of curricula, again, in part because states require it, so there's got to be something that's done there, but also because a lot of people in this space all over the country feel like there's not enough of that going on now, that's part of why our country is so divided and why we feel like we lack a common vocabulary. Some of it is happening here in Washington. The what so proudly we hail curriculum that AEI was invested in. There's important work getting started by Adam Kissel at the Philanthropy Roundtable. I think Adam's here. There's Adam. That kind of work is extremely important, and again, it gets us talking with ourselves and with each other about what it is that needs to be done in this space. And I think once we are agreed that this has to be part of an essential core part of what we're talking about in the education debates, then we've already made some progress. It doesn't solve the problem. The real hard debates come then, but that's how we start.
When I think of progressive educators like John Dewey advocating for education for democracy, and progressives more generally probably not liking the idea that the only goal of education should be just to educate for the workforce or to be good workers. I'm wondering, is there room for a possibility of a bipartisan coalition where progressives and conservatives get behind more like character and civics education?
Yeah. Well, I hope so. It is awfully hard to find common ground around these questions now, because I think there is really a dispute about what we would be teaching in civic education that's pretty fundamental, and it's an argument that really has to be had. And it does seem to me that in a lot of ways, the progressive side of the ledger focuses on things that we ought to be careful to teach our kids against. That is, we have to make sure that they know that there's also a darker side to American history, which they do need to know. We have to be sure they know that there are oppressed minorities in American life, which is very important. But that emphasis assumes that they already know the basic story, right? We all learn this in school, and now we need to learn the other side. Well, they haven't learned the first side. And so I think, we have to recognize, I forget who it was that said that kids are the person who missed the last meeting. They start from scratch. Nobody told them what it is that they've been misinformed about. They haven't been informed. And so I think civic education really does have to start by establishing some basic foundation of knowledge that then can be argued about in the higher grades, can be added onto and deepened. I think at this point the left-right debate about civics is very, very complicated by the desire of a lot of progressive educators to make sure that kids are not given too rosy a picture of American life. I think it's well-intentioned. I have no doubt it is. But there has to be at least some picture of American life given to begin with. So that's just to say, I hope there can be some bipartisan agreement. if you found examples of it, I'd love to see it, because I would love to feel better about that part of this. Certainly, I do think that when it comes to character education with younger children, there would have to be more room for that kind of bipartisan agreement. You almost have to say now, we should want bipartisan agreement. It's not actually obvious if you spend a lot of time here in Washington that that's true, but we should want bipartisan agreement. We should look for ways to achieve it. We should not imagine that the side we disagree with is going to go away if we just win one more election. We've got to live together with each other in this country. And so we absolutely have to find opportunities where we don't have to disagree and where we don't have to treat American life as a fight to the death on every little point. If civics can be part of that, I would love to be involved. I'm not sure that's the place to start, but hopefully it's a place we can get to.
All right, well said. But back to debates. Now let me ask you about a very contentious issue related, discipline. Those of us in this world have been in a huge debate over disciplining kids. And surely it's part of this question around moral freedom. I mean, you talked about the differences between progressives and conservatives. I mean, here you go. Is when you discipline a child, especially if they are part of an oppressed minority, is that the oppressor in the oppressed? Or the conservative view being, oh my God, these are all these children, as Jonah Goldberg said a few months ago here, children, all of our children are barbarians at the gates, and we have to civilize them every generation. And so we have to hold the line to try to teach these kids, all kids, how to be civilized. And if we allow constant disruption, we take tools away from teachers, we don't let them do anything to discipline kids who are misbehaving, we're at the very least being utopian about the nature of human nature and childhood. Or we're spoiling everything for the rest of the kids who can't learn. So I guess the question would be simply, do you agree that this question around discipline, how we model, how we actually show kids on a daily basis, here's what's expected of you, has to be a part of this conversation?
Yeah, of course, but that's not to say that I've got an answer for you for how to address that problem. And I think it's a profoundly difficult question, and there's a reason why it's so contentious. I think it's very much connected to character formation, and again, that's something you see in the KIPP schools and in other places that really emphasize discipline, that it's enormously important in order to create the environment where other kinds of learning can happen. But these arguments are legitimate arguments, and maybe I'm at too high a level of abstraction to be able to answer that kind of question. I mean, you asked a political theorist to talk about education policy, so you get what you paid for.
Yes.
But I'd have to tell you that when I spend an hour in my son's kindergarten class watching that teacher handle 20 of those kids, I think to myself, my God, this is hard.
Yes.
Yes. And so there is not a simple formula for on the discipline question. I think it's absolutely related to character formation. It's absolutely related to, again, creating the environment for schools to function. But it's not surprising that this is such a contentious issue, naturally.
Checker?
Among the least naive people I know. I think on the topic of local school boards, you might be naive.
Okay, good to know.
If you think that they're going to work these things out. Recommendations of the superintendent's agenda and the patronage and the trivia and the teachers union, the 15,000 local school boards of America do not have a great track record on things like profoundly important curricular choices. And you're really asking them to make profoundly important curricular choices. They're no good at that. Can we come up with another mechanism for resolving these things?
Yes. Checker is probably the least favorite person in the country from the perspective of school boards, because he says things like this on a regular basis.
Yeah. Well, look, you're not wrong, of course, but to your final question, could we find a better way to do this? I think the answer to that may be no. That is, I don't suggest we should have school boards wrestle with these questions because I think they're going to be great at it. I just suggest that because I don't think it's going to be done better anywhere else. And I think that it would be good for these boards and for the communities they serve if they thought about these questions more rather than less. I have a kind of Tocquevillian attitude about local government. Tocqueville says local government is not good government, it's awful government, but it's good for the people involved that it happens the way it does, because it is how we learn to be citizens and how we learn to take serious questions seriously. So look, do I expect that to end up with model curriculum everywhere? No. Of course not. That's not going to happen. But I do think that we would be better off if these kinds of questions were on the table at local school boards, at state school boards and state policymaking levels. Maybe at some level it needs to happen in the federal government too. I don't think there's much to be done at the federal level on this kind of question. But I'm just saying more of it. I'm not suggesting that I think that problems get solved magically. I've fallen asleep at enough school board meetings to have a sense of what these things are like, and I don't think I'm too naive about them, but I try to be a little naive about them. That's the way to sort of keep yourself fresh as a citizen.
Well, we will let you end on that positive note, since so much of the rest of the talk was a bit of a downer. Please join me in thanking Yuval Levin for his great comments.